No one expected grapes to grow here. Not in this heat, not in this sand, not in a place where even goats refuse to walk. And yet, in the heart of Burkina Faso's desert, 250,000 hectares of vineyards now stretch across the horizon, rows of green vines glistening under the Sahel sun. They call it Traore's Desert Vineyard, a project so ambitious that some say it could redefine African agriculture forever. Others call it madness, a leader trying to outgrow the desert itself. Under President Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso is not just planting food anymore. It's planting prestige power in the promise of independence. Wine experts say the idea is impossible. Grapes demand cool nights and soft rain. The Sahel offers neither. And yet satellite images show something alive, spreading green. So tonight we ask the question no one dares to answer. Can the desert truly yield wine? Or is this Traore's most dangerous illusion yet? It began with a simple announcement, one that sent ripples through every agricultural boardroom from Accra to Paris. On May 18, 2027, President Ibrahim Traore declared that Burkina Faso would allocate 250,000 hectares of arid land in the country's northeast for grape cultivation. The name of the project, Sahel Vineyards. Standing before a backdrop of sand dunes and military trucks retrofitted as water carriers, Traore said, "If others can turn deserts into oil, then we can turn ours into life." The plan was stunning in its scale. According to the Ministry of Agriculture, the goal wasn't just to grow table grapes, it was to create Africa's first desert-based wine and juice industry capable of producing 400 million liters per year by 2030. 250,000 hectares, that's twice the area of New York City. In a country once ranked among the poorest on earth, such ambition felt almost mythic. State television aired dramatic images, lines of tractors cutting through dunes, pipes being laid underground, and soldiers planting vine saplings in neat rows. The narrative was clear: Burkina Faso would no longer depend on others for food or pride. Reveal number one came a week later when the government released the first set of numbers. The project would cost $2.8 billion, funded through a combination of national reserves and private partners. No one knew who those partners were. When asked, the Minister of Finance smiled and said, "Only friends of African sovereignty." Inside Burkina Faso, reactions were mixed. In the capital, students cheered the announcement, calling it proof that we can dream big again. In rural areas, farmers whispered a different question: why grapes? We don't even eat them. Local radio shows buzzed with debate. Some saw it as visionary, a way to export high-value crops instead of importing cheap grain. Others saw it as vanity and expensive gamble in a land still struggling with drought and hunger. Internationally, the project drew even sharper scrutiny. European media mocked it as Traore's desert wine fantasy. But in China and Brazil, agricultural engineers watched with interest. They knew that if it worked, it could rewrite every map of viable farmland on the planet. Within months, hundreds of kilometers of drip irrigation lines were laid underground. The first saplings, imported from Tunisia, Algeria, and Spain, were adapted with local rootstock to survive the dry heat. State TV proudly reported that 50,000 hectares had already been planted. To prove it, drones filmed a sea of green vines shimmering against the horizon, the desert sand fading beneath them. Traore's office issued a statement: "We are building not a vineyard but a legacy." Yet whispers grew louder. Environmental experts warned that grapes require more water than any local crop. Economists pointed out that even if the project succeeded, it would take years before returns appeared. And human rights activists questioned the use of conscripted labor from rural youth programs. Still, Traore pressed on, calling the project a symbol of resistance against scarcity. For him, this wasn't about fruit, it was about sovereignty. By the end of that first season, over 80,000 Burkinabe workers had been assigned to the green frontier. Truckloads of compost mulch and soil amendments moved daily. The desert was changing slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. And as the first vines reached knee height, one question began to dominate headlines: where was all the water coming from? Because behind every green leaf in the desert, one journalist said, there's always a source someone doesn't want you to find. Don't blink, that's where the real story begins. Behind every miracle is a mechanism, and behind Traore's desert vineyard, there was one secret word repeated in every internal memo: hydrosphere. Officially, hydrosphere was a water management project run by the Ministry of Agriculture. Unofficially, it was a classified joint initiative between the Burkinabe army and a small group of engineers from Morocco and Chile countries, with long experience growing grapes in arid climates. Their task: make water appear where none existed. According to leaked technical documents, the Sahel Vineyard project relied on a hybrid system of underground aquifer tapping and atmospheric condensation grids, steel structures designed to collect water vapor at night and drip it directly into the soil at dawn. The system had been tested successfully on a smaller scale in the 2025 potato project. Now it was being expanded 100-fold. Reveal number 2 came when satellite imagery showed long metallic lines stretching across the northern region, not pipelines but condensers glinting in the sun. Each grid could collect up to 12,000 liters of water per day, powered by local microgrids of wind turbines. This was no ordinary farm. It was an engineered ecosystem. But why grapes? Traore's aides provided an answer that sounded almost poetic. Because grapes hold memory. They transform heat into sweetness. The real reason, however, was economic. Global demand for organic wine and natural juices had exploded since 2025, and European suppliers were struggling with droughts of their own. Burkina Faso saw a vacuum and Traore wanted to fill it. By growing wine grapes in the Sahel, the country could enter a high-value export market worth billions. If successful, it would make Burkina the first sub-Saharan nation to compete with Mediterranean agriculture. But to achieve that, the government needed technology, money, and expertise far beyond its borders. And that's where the mystery deepened. Financial analysts discovered that part of the project's funding came from a newly formed consortium registered in Casablanca Sahel Terra Group, whose shareholders were hidden behind shell companies. Tracing the names led to a mix of Moroccan investors, Russian agricultural firms, and a South African logistics company with ties to state contracts. No one knew exactly who was in control. One Western diplomat described it as a geopolitical cocktail served in a wine glass. Traore, meanwhile, framed it differently. In a fiery speech before the National Assembly, he declared, "For too long, Africa has sold its gold, its oil, and its blood. Now it will sell its fruit grown from its own dust." His words electrified the youth. Social media exploded with the hashtag Vineyards of Freedom. Videos of young workers planting vines in the desert went viral, the new face of African pride. But not everyone was convinced. Environmental scientists warned that over-extraction of groundwater could trigger ecological collapse within a decade. French newspapers accused Traore of greenwashing authoritarianism. And even inside his own government, whispers grew of a quiet deal: grapes in exchange for geopolitical allegiance. One leaked diplomatic cable from a West African embassy read, "The vineyard is not about agriculture. It's about influence. Whoever controls Sahel Terra controls Traore." Still, the plan pressed forward. Vineyards expanded, nurseries multiplied, and rumors of a new winery under construction near Ouahigouya surfaced online. Yet beneath the celebration, a question lingered. Was this really a triumph of African engineering, or a carefully constructed trade-off between sovereignty and survival? As one anonymous engineer put it, "We can make water from air, but what we can't make is trust." And so the mystery deepened. The vineyard was growing, the desert was shrinking, but the truth about who truly owned this miracle was still buried beneath the sand. Coming up next, the world reacts: praise, fear, and the first signs of a political storm that could determine whether Traore's desert dream becomes Africa's new gold or its next curse. Inside Burkina Faso, the vineyard became more than a project. It became a dividing line between believers and skeptics. In Ouagadougou, murals appeared overnight, showing Ibrahim Traore holding a bunch of grapes like a trophy. Below it, graffiti read, "We grow our own future." State TV called it the dawn of Sahel prosperity. But out in the desert, far from the speeches and slogans, the story looked very different. In the small settlement of Tinikoff, 43-year-old Moussa Ballo watched the first vines crawl across the sand near his village. He had spent his whole life herding goats through land no one wanted. When the tractors came, he thought it was a military operation. When they told me they would plant grapes, he said, laughing softly, "I thought they were joking. Now my goats eat the leaves." Moussa became one of the first local workers hired to maintain the vines. He earns twice what he did before, and his children no longer walk 10 kilometers for water. The condensation grids provide it daily. Still, he shrugs when reporters call it a miracle. If it rains, it's God's work. If the vines live, that's Traore's work. Either way, I'm just here to keep the sand away. Reveal number 3 came in the autumn of 2027. The Ministry of Agriculture announced that 50,000 tons of grapes had been harvested from pilot plots, the first ever in Burkina Faso's desert. The announcement spread across Africa like wildfire. In Mali, local papers asked, "Can the Sahel turn green after all?" In Niger, agricultural officials visited to study the irrigation model. Even Ghana expressed interest in importing Burkina's drought-resistant vine seedlings. But not all eyes looked kindly. France's Le Monde Afrique ran a front-page headline, "Traore's Vineyard of Control." It accused the government of using the project to expand military presence in the north under the guise of agricultural protection. European environmental groups called it a water-consuming fantasy in a dying land. One columnist asked bluntly, "What happens when the wells run dry? Do the grapes die or the people?" International reactions split sharply. China and Turkey offered to invest in processing facilities. Russia announced plans to buy Burkina grape concentrate for its beverage industry. Meanwhile, the United Nations requested data on water usage, a polite way of saying, "We don't believe your numbers." Inside Burkina Faso, however, optimism overpowered fear. Young people from across the country traveled north to work the fields, calling themselves the children of the dust. Social media videos showed them singing as they pruned vines at dawn, their laughter echoing across the dunes. For them, the vineyard wasn't about economics, it was about pride. "It's the first time my parents believe our land can do something great," said one young worker. "We used to send food abroad for aid. Now they'll buy our wine." But the deeper you look, the stranger the story became. The project's expansion zone, 250,000 hectares, included lands once considered part of restricted military areas. Satellite images revealed not just vineyards, but what appeared to be underground storage facilities and fenced compounds. The government called them temperature control units. Foreign analysts weren't so sure. By late 2027, the U.S. State Department quietly requested a report on Hectares ownership. In Brussels, EU officials debated new trade restrictions on Burkina agricultural exports until environmental transparency improved. And yet Traore's popularity soared at home. For millions of Burkina, the sight of green vines and yellow sand was more powerful than any speech. For the first time in generations, the desert felt conquerable. Still, one question persisted, whispered in markets, schools, and even among the vineyard workers themselves. How long can something this green survive on land this dry? As one agronomist in Ouahigouya put it, the vines are growing fast, but so is the silence around them. The project had become both symbol and secret, a living paradox between hope and control. Coming up next, confidential papers leak, revealing who truly owns Sahel Terra and why the vineyard might not be about wine at all. It started with a leak. Not a rumor, not a tweet, but a 61-page confidential document uploaded anonymously to an encrypted forum. The title read, "Sahel Terra Consortium Internal Shareholding Agreement 2027. Buried in the fine print were the words that changed everything. Primary beneficiary, Sahel Development Fund, Abu Dhabi secondary holder, Orbis Agrodefense, LLC, Moscow and Burkina National Sovereignty Council. For months, Traore's government had insisted the project was 100% nationally owned. But the leaked pages told another story: foreign capital, foreign technology, and foreign conditions. One clause stood out. In the event of political instability, full operational control reverts to the International Consortium for Asset Protection. That meant if Traore ever lost power, the vineyard and the billions in infrastructure beneath it would legally fall into foreign hands. The revelation hit like a sandstorm. Within hours, the document spread across West Africa. Hashtags, who owns the vineyard, and #Traore files dominated social media. State television called it a fabrication of imperial propaganda. But journalists noticed something strange. The watermark on every leaked page matched the official seal of Burkina Faso's Ministry of Finance. Foreign press pounced. Reuters called it a sovereignty scandal. The New York Times asked bluntly, "Has Traore sold Africa's desert miracle?" In Paris, government analysts described the arrangement as economic securitization by stealth, using agriculture to mask geopolitical control. And yet in Ouagadougou, no one from the administration could explain why the document mentioned agro-defense, a term usually reserved for dual-use technology. Within days, satellite analysts identified restricted areas inside the vineyard zones. Large rectangular compounds surrounded by fences and guarded by military trucks. Officially, they were storage facilities for irrigation equipment. Unofficially, their layout resembled supply depots. By now, the question had shifted from agriculture to strategy. Was the vineyard just a front, a civilian project feeding a regional alliance no one had publicly admitted existed? When cornered by reporters, Traore gave one of the most quoted lines of his presidency: "They look for conspiracies in our soil because they can't believe we made it fertile." Crowds cheered, but the unease remained. If the documents were fake, why hadn't the government released the originals? If they were real, who exactly controlled the future of 250,000 hectares of grapes and the water systems beneath them? One insider within the Ministry of Infrastructure whispered to a local journalist, "It's bigger than wine, much bigger." And that's where the story takes a turn no one saw coming, because the next leak wouldn't come from Burkina Faso at all, but from abroad. Right after this, the documents from Europe reveal the truth behind the so-called desert wine deal and what Traore might actually be building under those vines. The next leak came not from Ouagadougou, but from Brussels. A 1 in 12-page European Commission report titled "The Desert Wine Deal" surfaced online. It confirmed what many had feared: the Vineyard project was not purely agricultural. It was geopolitical infrastructure, a hybrid of food production, logistics, and regional defense. According to the report, the Sahel Terra Group had quietly registered subsidiaries in Dubai, Moscow, and Algiers. Its stated goal: integrated agricultural security. Translation: dual-use zones capable of producing food in peacetime and storing resources in conflict. The document detailed how the underground water grids could be repurposed as cooling systems for energy storage, and the vineyard's roads and supply lines matched those of a logistical military corridor stretching north to Mali. The EU called it a silent militarization under the veil of agriculture. Reveal number 4 hit international headlines. For the first time, Western governments accused Burkina Faso of building what they termed strategic self-reliance infrastructure. In diplomatic language, that meant too independent. Paris demanded transparency. Washington froze $70 million in agricultural cooperation funds. Meanwhile, Moscow and Ankara issued statements praising the courage of African nations to reclaim their land and destiny. Inside, Burkina Faso Traore addressed the nation in a live broadcast. He didn't deny the leaks. He reframed them. "They accuse us of building too much too fast, but they forget they built empires on our silence. We are not arming the desert. We are feeding it." The crowd in Ouagadougou roared with applause. Across the capital, young Burkinabe painted new graffiti, "Wine of Freedom." Yet international economists weren't buying it. One IMF analyst wrote, "Every major infrastructure in the Sahel now carries dual-purpose potential. What begins as food may end as fortification." But even as global headlines screamed Traore's wine empire, something unexpected happened. Satellite data from NASA confirmed that the vineyard's cooling systems had reduced surface temperatures in surrounding regions by up to 1.3 degrees Celsius. Rainfall increased slightly. What began as a political scandal started to look like an ecological breakthrough. Traore's supporters seized on the new data immediately. "Even if it's a fortress," one youth leader said, "it's a green one." Still, critics pointed out that the environmental benefits didn't erase the financial risks. At $2.8 billion in projected costs, the vineyard represented nearly a quarter of Burkina Faso's GDP. Western outlets asked, who will pay when the vines dry up? Traore's allies responded with defiance. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed a new memorandum under the Alliance of Sahel Nations, AES, officially to promote agricultural self-sufficiency, unofficially to create a shared logistics network across the desert. To many, it looked like the birth of a new geopolitical bloc, one built not on weapons, but on water and crops. European media called it the Green Axis. African outlets called it the Second Independence. Meanwhile, in the Sahel itself, the vines kept growing. Moussa Ballo, the farmer from Tinakov, sent a voice message to a journalist. "They argue in cities, we harvest in silence." But questions remained. Was the success real or stage-managed? A report by Transparency Africa alleged that several contracts were granted to shell companies linked to military elites. When pressed, government spokesmen dismissed it as colonial noise. Then came the counterattack. Pro-Traore media released footage of European wine companies lobbying against African exports, framing the outrage as economic jealousy disguised as environmental concern. "When we starve, they call it tragedy. When we feed ourselves, they call it threat," said one Burkinabe commentator on national TV. By the end of 2028, the controversy had transformed the vineyard into a political symbol across Africa, half miracle, half warning. To his supporters, Traore had done the impossible, proven that the Sahel could feed itself and profit. To his critics, he had created a system too opaque, too strategic, and too powerful for one man to control. And as journalists scrambled for clarity, one phrase from the European report lingered. The true value of the vineyard is not in its grapes, but in what lies beneath them. Coming up next beneath those vines, tunnels, sensors, and something even more astonishing in evidence, that the desert itself might be changing faster than anyone thought. For months, the desert had been the center of controversy. But far from the cameras, far from the political debates in Ouagadougou and Brussels, life on the sand had begun to change. In the settlement of Gassi, a young engineer named Awa Sanu adjusts a sensor buried in the soil. At 27, she oversees one of the vineyard's irrigation clusters, a position that before the project would have been unthinkable for a woman from her village. Her hands, once used to carry water jugs, now control a network that feeds 50 hectares of vines. When I was little, Awa says the wind was the only thing that moved here. Now we make the land move. She isn't interested in the politics. She measures success in liters and leaves. Her cluster produces 12 tons of grapes every 2 weeks, and with each harvest, more local families find work. Behind her, 3 boys laugh as they load crates onto an old truck painted with the words, Sahel Vineyards, Pride of the Desert. Across northern Burkina Faso, similar scenes unfold. Families who once survived on aid are now building co-ops to sell grape juice and dried raisins to the local market. The government publishes new data. Over 150,000 people employed, 40% of them women. 32 towns now connected to the vineyard's water system. For the first time, the Sahel is exporting something other than hope. Reveal number 5 came quietly in the form of an international agreement. Burkina Faso signed a trade partnership with South Africa and India to process its grapes into bioethanol and organic wine. It wasn't just an agricultural victory, it was an entry ticket into global value chains long dominated by Europe. At the national level, the numbers spoke louder than any speech. The GDP rose by 8.6% in a single year, driven mostly by agricultural exports. Rural migration slowed. School attendance in the vineyard zones increased by 30%. The vines had become more than crops, they were infrastructure. At the regional level, Mali and Niger launched their own pilot vineyards using Burkina's technology, forming what newspapers called the Green Crescent. Together, the 3 nations plan to convert over 500,000 hectares of desert into fertile land within 5 years. Analysts in Dakar called it the quiet revolution of the Sahel. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. For decades, the Sahel had been defined by what it lacked: rain, stability, attention. Now, for the first time, it was defined by creation. International reaction began to soften. France, after months of criticism, sent an agricultural envoy to study the technology. Japan proposed a development loan to replicate the condensation system. Even the UN Food Program called the vineyard a model of adaptive innovation. And yet Awa Sanu's voice carries the most powerful argument. They say this place was nothing, she tells a visiting reporter. But it's not nothing if people live here. It's not nothing if it feeds us. Still beneath her optimism lies realism. If we stop working, the sand will take it back in a week. Her words echo the fragile balance of the Sahel growth built on discipline, not miracles. At the global level, environmental scientists study the vineyard's microclimate effects. Early results show reduced dust storms, improved soil carbon, and a new pattern of nighttime condensation spreading beyond project boundaries. It's as if the desert is learning to breathe again. Back in Ouagadougou, Traore delivers a quieter speech than usual. Gone are the slogans. His tone is measured, almost humble. We are not chasing miracles, he says. We are building the patience of a people who refuse to disappear. Even some critics admit the transformation is real. The vineyard that once symbolized suspicion now represents resilience. Still others warn, don't confuse progress with permanence. The desert always waits. But for the farmers of Tinakaf, for engineers like Awa, for thousands who now wake to the sight of vines instead of dunes, the change feels irreversible. When my daughter sees green every morning, Awa says she thinks this is how the world always looked. That's victory enough for me. And as the sun sets across the vast horizon of green and gold, one truth becomes clear. The desert may not have surrendered, but it has learned to share. Coming up next, a final question. If the Sahel can grow grapes, what else can Africa create when it finally controls its own destiny? The desert was never meant to bloom. And yet under a blazing Sahel sun, 250,000 hectares of grapes now stand as proof that what once looked like ruin can become renewal. For Burkina Faso, this vineyard is more than a project, it's a declaration. A nation that once begged for aid now exports life. Every vine planted is a quiet act of defiance against the idea that Africa must remain dependent to survive. For the Sahel region, it's a new chapter, a blueprint for how deserts can feed nations, how resilience can become an economy. Across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, engineers and farmers now speak the same language. We grow or we vanish. Borders that once divided are now linked by green corridors and shared ambition. And for the world, this story forces a question few are ready to answer. If Africa can make grapes grow in sand, what else can it do when it stops asking permission? If sovereignty can be cultivated, not granted, what happens to the balance of global power? Because this isn't just about wine, it's about ownership. It's about who controls the future, the one who plants or the one who doubts. As the sun sinks over the Sahel, Awa Sanu wipes the dust from her hands and watches the light turn the vines gold. They said nothing could live here, she whispers. Now even the wind smells of fruit. Perhaps that's the real victory, not just growth, but proof. Proof that when Africa builds with belief, the impossible becomes inevitable. Next episode, the Sahara Reservoir. How Traore plans to turn the desert's wind into water. Subscribe and join the story of a continent rewriting its destiny. One seed, one drop, one idea at a time. Africa bows to no one. Disclaimer, this video is fictional storytelling created for education, commentary, and entertainment. It is not a factual report or official information. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. Please enjoy it as creative content only.